All right, I think we'll get started. People will continue to trickle in. Welcome to FIJ's monthly webinar, Inside the Investigation. I'm Ellen Weiss. I'm a board member of FIJ. And today we'll be talking with Jessica, and we're very excited about that. We started these webinars for a couple of reasons. One, we get a chance to shine some light on terrific and impactful investigative work from reporters and sort of hear how they did these groundbreaking investigations. They get to share concrete tips and resources with all of you in case you're interested in doing this kind of work. We get to feature investigations that FIJ funded, and we can talk more about how you can apply for an FIJ grant and how we can help you. We'll have that at the end of the webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Rebecca and I are going to chat for about 30 minutes. If you have questions, please just add them to the Q&A section, to the questions section. And we'll get to them. We're recording this webinar and we're going to be posting it and with tip sheet on the FIJ website, but we'll also be sending it to anyone who registered. So you don't have to furiously be taking notes if you're worried about that. So Jessica Miller has spent more than a decade investigating Utah's criminal justice system, and her reporting has led to policy changes and new laws. It's really been incredible. She was part of the Salt Lake Tribune's team coverage of sexual assault on Utah college campuses. That coverage received a bunch of national awards, including the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. Jessica is also a two-time Livingston Award finalist. Her ongoing work reporting on the teen treatment industry for the investigative podcast Sent Away earned a gold Bartlett and Steele Award and a national headliner honor in 2023. By the way, the Steele in the Bartlett and Steele Award is Jim Steele. Jim Steele is also a member of the FIJ board. And Jessica just completed yet another great collaboration with ProPublica, this one on life coaches. But today we're going to talk about an investigation that Jessica produced also in 2023. In August that year, the Salt Lake Tribune and ProPublica, working together, reported on a range of sexual abuse allegations against a Utah therapist who had built a reputation over his 20-year career as a specialist who could help gay men who are also members of the LDS Church. Several of the patients in previous years had complained to the church or the state licensing board about the inappropriate touching during therapy sessions, but it would actually be years before the therapist gave up his license, and then a little bit more. This reporting posed a lot of challenges. There was finding and verifying sources, probing the church, getting and analyzing data from Utah's Division of Professional Licensing. But as you hear, the more they reported and exposed the problems, the more they learned as the story continued to unfold for months with enormous impact. So Jessica, I just scratched the surface in describing your reporting, but could you say a little bit more about what you did?
Yeah, so this story actually came to us through like not a tip line, like a form that we had, a community form where we were asking for people we were doing a project on sexual assault in medical settings. And so we asked Utahns, like, can you tell us your stories about if you have an experience of sexual assault or harassment by your medical provider? And two men filled out the form, both about this therapist, Scott Owen. One was actually a family member of his who said that he was assaulted by Scott when they were children. And then another was a former patient. And so we had this, or had this tip of, there's a therapist, he's not working any longer, but he still owns a therapy business. He's still kind of involved in this realm, and these allegations of sexual touching had come up with licensors and with the church, and nothing had happened really. And so that was kind of the base of where we started. and they had already kind of connected with some other victims, and so they were able to kind of connect me with that network as well, and then I was able to speak with several of his former patients that kind of all gave the same account of being inappropriately touched during these therapy sessions.
That's really amazing. I know that a lot of news organizations have like tip suggestions. I love the form that you have, and it's great to hear that you actually get great stories potentially that come through that to come through that line. So three of the sources for this story, and you called them Andrew, Sam, and Jason. They're only identified, by pseudonyms because they requested anonymity. Two are victims of the sexual assaults. The third is the brother of one of the men. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that decision to keep them anonymous, and like why the pseudonyms as opposed to, some other. I've used initials, whatever. But what other approaches did you consider?
Yeah, that's actually kind of interesting because this is kind of some of the tension that you get when you're working essentially inside two separate newsrooms that have two separate policies for when to allow people to be anonymous. At the Tribune, we've always kind of taken the stance of, or it's been our policy that if we're reporting about victims of sexual assault, alleged sexual assault, that we don't identify them unless they want to be named. And usually when I will talk with victims about that, I kind of let them make the choice. Like, do you want to use your initial? Do you want to use your middle name? Do you want to, use a pseudonym? And so I kind of let them choose. And I think in this scenario, most like all of the men that I spoke with who were identified by pseudonym, that was their preference because they're they were just really worried about their standing in the community and with their jobs, if it's very publicly known, details about their sexuality, details about, going to this therapist. There was a lot of risk for them, and so I think even identifying them by initials or by a middle name, um, was still kind of risky in their minds, and so we went the pseudonym route, which later learned in our conversations is not ProPublica's preference. They would like to use full names. So we kind of had a little bit of discussion there. But I think as we talked about, like I just said, like this is a scenario where even a middle name, even a couple initials could potentially identify them and you know bring harm. We're talking about very specific details of what churches they were in, at what timeline, like, it's not that hard to narrow down, if you have some, small identifying pieces of information.
Yeah, it's a small community. I would love, as people hear this discussion about, what's your policy about anonymity? I would love, maybe just throw into the Q&A or just think about for later, because I do think newsrooms struggle with this. Reporters coming into, or people coming into journalism have different feelings about it. And so I just think it's an ongoing conversation. Um, so how did you go about corroborating their stories?
Yeah, that like, I've done a lot of reporting on sexual assault, and a lot of times you have, like, a civil lawsuit or, like, they reported to police, and so you have, like, a government document that kind of corroborates what they're saying, and that really wasn't the case here. Some of these men had never reported, some had gone to licensors, some had gone to their church, and so the way that I tried to corroborate these accounts was to kind of ask them, who did you talk to at the time about this when this was happening in your life? Um, did you have a journal that talks about this? Did you exchange emails with a therapist that you can share with me? What text messages did you send? And that was particularly important with one of the alleged victims actually couldn't speak to me directly. And so I had to corroborate his entire story without kind of having him be a participant. And so that's where we really relied on like a timeline that he had created, text messages, things like that. It's kind of interesting within the LDS church, which most of these men were. Obviously, that's why they got referred to this therapist. Like journaling and documentation is like kind of a thing in particular with that community. And so they do tend to have a lot of journals or timelines, documentation, things like that. That's just kind of something that is valued in the church and in that community. So a lot of times they do have written materials that they're willing to share.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like the stakes for them were so high. I imagine, maybe other than, as you reported, telling some people in the church. I mean, talking to a reporter was such a risky thing. How did you establish that rapport, that trust? Like, what did you do, in order to, I guess, make sure that they felt like you could handle their story responsibly? Because that it just sounds like the risks were really great for them.
Yeah, and I think in the tip sheet, I had referred to the Dart Center several times. They have a lot of really great, tip sheets, to look at, and so I kind of tried to take the lessons I've learned from reading a lot of Dart Center material and how to work with people who have gone through trauma and apply that in these interviews. And so I think to start, usually, I think sometimes we forget that like regular people don't interact with journalists daily. And so they don't know what like off the record means, on the record means. Like, why are you asking me this? What is the story? How does the reporting process work? Like, that's not like, yes, that's normal for, like, the governor, but not normal for just, like, a regular person, and so, really detailing why I wanna talk with them, where the story's going, the limit, like, maybe saying, "I don't really know if we've got a story yet, but I wanna hear more. What questions do you have for me about the reporting process?" Just making sure it's a dialogue, and then really emphasizing that they have control of the conversation. We can take breaks. If I ask you something that I don't realize is triggering to you or makes you uncomfortable, we don't have to talk about certain parts of this. It's whatever they're kind of comfortable sharing. And I think through building that initial rapport of like, you're in control, you can kind of drive this conversation, helps to build that trust initially. And then when you're going back and it's not an easy ask to be like, "I'm a stranger, please give me, like, your diaries," or, like, "Get me in touch with someone that was your study partner 10 years ago who you told about this abuse." That's a kind of a difficult ask to make, and so kind of starting that groundwork of trust and them feeling in control, I think really helps when you do have to corroborate and kind of poke around in their lives a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm gonna share my screen in a second. I wonder if you could talk us through some of the images that you use, because again, this question of anonymity, but you want to kind of bring out like who are these people? Like they're not just victims, they're human beings. And I thought that you guys went about it in a very creative way. So let me just share my screen. And then maybe you could talk us through these images. Yeah. Cool. So what are we looking at?
Yeah, our photographer, Leah Hodgson, took these, and this is like such a skill that she has. I've worked with her on so many stories about sexual assault, and she just has a really great eye for trying to, show who these people are without obviously showing their identity. And so she went to, I think I called him Andrew in the story, went to his home, talked with him. I wasn't there because sometimes I kind of like, I feel like just Leah and the subject, it's a more private moment. I don't need to be at every one of these. So I'm not sure how their conversation went, but obviously she was able to gain his trust to where he felt comfortable showing or being photographed in his bedroom. And so what you're seeing here are some of the decorations in his bedroom, which shows, kind of who he is. I love that the gay away the pray candle. It kind of really shows his journey from being very religious and being very part of the LDS church to kind of not so much being into that anymore and embracing his identity as a gay man instead. And so I think that these small details really show you a lot about his life, and you don't need to see his face to really like get who he is or understand parts of his life.
Yeah. Here's another one. If you can read it, it says fabulous. Is this also
And
Andrew?
And then
Um,
yeah, this is also Andrew, and then I think the next one shows this is the photo that was, like, our main photo that shows him, but obviously he's, shadowed. I think that they did add a little bit of shadow in there, to make sure that he wasn't identifiable, and, a lot of times it's kind of uncomfortable. I know, like, journalists don't like to share the products before or the content before it's published, but I think especially here where we wanted to make sure he was very comfortable with this photo and, not having some paper in the corner that actually has his name on it or something that we didn't catch. We did show him this image and make sure that he was comfortable with it and that it represented him, but not so much where he felt his identity was being exposed.
Got it. Great. Thank you. That was really interesting. So when Andrew first went to the Division of Public Licensing, they actually did an investigation, but it was really kind of a wild ride that ended up with him taking a lie detector test. I mean, him and the therapist both. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, because it also meant you had to kind of like deal with this whole question of lie detectors as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard that he had been asked to take a lie detector test, I was just like, "What? Like, that doesn't like, you have a victim take a lie detector test?" Like, it just seemed so odd, and I know it happens, apparently it happens, but it is outlawed in, like, half of states because there is a lot of research that shows, well, 1, lie detector tests aren't really that reliable anyways, but especially for sexual assault victims, when you're asking them these type of questions, they often have a trauma response, and the trauma response indicates deception. So, like, they're not great for these type of investigations anyways. So when Andrew went to Doppel, they, I guess, had gone to the therapist, and the therapist wouldn't take a lie detector test and, kind of denied the allegations. And so they'd first asked him if he would like wear a wire and go in and try to record like a confession. And he said, I can't, like, that's too much. I can't do that. So then they asked him, well, why don't you take a lie detector test? That way it can bolster this kind of one side versus the other. And so he didn't know the research about lie detector tests and how they work, and so he decided to do it, and the outcome was it showed he was deceptive, and that really affected him very deeply. It re-traumatized him. Sexual assault victims already often feel like they're not believed, and then they go to report, they're asked to take this uncomfortable lie detector test, and then it shows he's deceptive. He really kind of spiraled out after that, which led to him pulling out of the investigation. He did not wanna participate any longer. And so how that case ended, because he didn't wanna participate, is the therapist was able to get a public reprimand instead of any other, like, real disciplinary action, because he did admit that he gave Andrew hugs, which is not at all what Andrew says happened. He alleges a lot of inappropriate touching. But the therapist admitted that he had hugged a client and got the kind of, slap on the hand from the state, the public reprimand, and he kept practicing for a couple years after that, and didn't have to tell any of his patients that this complaint had been made, or that, he'd been reprimanded anyway.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of times people are fleeing for documents and data, but the Department of Public Licensing actually, their records are online and you can actually look things up, right? So it puts the disciplinary records online, um, but it doesn't require the therapist to disclose that they've been disciplined. So unless you, as somebody who's seeking therapy, goes online to look, you actually, have no way of knowing. And so it enabled him to continue to, to harm people. Um, I mean, what difference would it have made if disclosure had been, had been required, not just that the records were public and you can go look, but that the therapists themselves were required to tell, incoming patients.
Yeah, I talked with another former patient who was seeing him right at that time when he had that public reprimand. And he was wrestling with this thought of like, is the way my therapist touching me, is this inappropriate? It was a lot of like really long hugs, like just things that felt like kind of icky to him. But he was kind of like, well, this, like, I have to trust my therapist. I have to trust this process. And he told me that, had he known that another client had made these type of allegations, or that Scott had admitted to inappropriately hugging a client, that would have helped inform him, to kind of tip the scale of like, oh, yes, like this is not appropriate behavior and I should stop seeing this therapist. But he didn't know that at the time. And he kept going to Scott, I think, for like 2 more years after that. So at least one client, would have loved to have had that information so he could make informed decisions about his healthcare and whether he wanted to keep seeing this therapist.
Yeah. So you published this story in August of 2023, and then in October, you published another story, and then there was a real bombshell in there about the church itself. I wonder if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, there was in the first story, there was a lot of connections with the church because Andrew had reported to his church leader. Another man had reported to his church leader, and the church didn't really do much with that. But what we learned, after that first story comes out, so many other former patients reached out and came forward, including several of them who said, my bishop paid for this therapy. I went to my bishop. I talked to him about, like, I'm struggling with, how do I be gay and be in this church? And not only did the bishop recommend Scott Owen to them, they also they kind of have money, like a little fund that they can use that comes from tithing that they can use to, help members out. They can help them with their medical bills or whatever. And so the church was actually paying for a lot of this therapy where these men say that they were touched inappropriately.
And how did you go about, trying to talk to the church? I mean, were they willing to speak with you? What was their response? Because you're right, there was first some of the victims going to their church leaders and saying, "This is happening." And then there was the question about them paying for a therapist who was on the record having been disciplined for inappropriate behavior. So how did they deal with it, and how did you deal with reporting that part of the story?
For that part, I mostly just sent them questions via email a couple of times, and then they responded. They didn't answer all the questions, which I guess is not that surprising. But the first story, they kind of they said that they did handle this appropriately. They felt, I think that they said that they put a mark on his record, like an annotation, so that he wouldn't be holding certain church positions. So they believe that they had handled it appropriately at that time. And then when we came to the question of paying for this therapy, they kind of said that, it's up to the members to vet their therapists, and like that's, individual choice that they made that decision to go to that therapist. And, talking with some of those men who did go, like, they found the idea that they had a choice to be kind of insulting, because, when especially in the LDS church, like, your bishop tells you to do something, and they really do have a lot of power over your life, especially if you're a student at BYU. You have to have a recommend from your bishop to stay in school. They decide whether you're, like, worthy to be in the temple, which is very important to people in that religion. And so if your bishop says, "You should go to this therapist and we'll pay for it," they don't really feel like they had that choice, that the church is now saying that, they should have vetted that person themselves.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. Um, what I love about your story is that it just keeps on unfolding, and I think it's a really good example of you exposing something that people actually didn't know there were other people, exposing it some more. So November, it's just 1 month later, another bombshell. Maybe tell us about what happened then.
Yeah, so he was arrested in November for
Just Scott
allegations.
Owen, the therapist.
Scott Owen, yes, yes, yes. And I think one thing that we harped on a lot in our reporting is, the church knew about this, Doppel knew about this. Did either one of them tell the police about this? The answer is no. Even though this is clearly criminal type of, or the allegations are of criminal conduct. And so the police actually started investigating after the story came out. And so from August to November, they were talking with former patients. I think they talked to like 12, and they ended up filing charges involving 2 men who were adults, and then a woman who said that she was like, he groped her during sessions when she was a teenager. So he's been in jail since November now and is still facing, I think it's 11 felonies for these 3 patients.
Wow, wow. I'm about to hopefully turn it over to the audience for questions. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A section. But I was curious, I know obviously the church played a big role, but also this whole idea that there's a Department of Public Licensing. Is this the kind of reporting that you think other people could be doing in terms of looking at disciplinary records? I don't know how many other states or cities might have public records that are online, but I just wonder if you feel like, oh yeah, this is repeatable, and it's not that hard to just at least check the records.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, therapists are regulated everywhere. And so there should be public records involving disciplinary actions. And what's interesting here is, like you said, the records are all online, but to find them you have to like search their name, like there's not like they don't have a whole database readily available where you can get this information. And they also won't give that to you. I asked that to them too. And so what we ended up doing is Utah puts out a newsletter every month that shows every disciplinary action that's been taken. Again, a transparency effort that's only like kind of helpful because, it's hard to piece together a trend, which is what we were trying to do, see how often are therapists being disciplined for sexual misconduct or like inappropriate touching. And that's hard to find out by searching names or looking at disciplinary files one at a time where you have to or disciplinary newsletters where then you have to like go to the records and see. So anyways, it's kind of a mess. So we ended up scraping the newsletters, making a like a database, and then scraping the disciplinary files themselves and feeding that into a database so that we could have it all in one place and be able to, search for words like touching or inappropriate contact or things like there's kind of similar words that they use in a lot of these filings. So we were able to identify kind of a pattern of how often therapists were being disciplined for this type of misconduct. So obviously every different state will be different in what they do with newsletter, like how they make these records public. But once you kind of figure out a way to get it all together, it's definitely could be replicated in other places as well.
Yeah, and I think you guys went back as far as 2010 and found, I wrote it down, I think there were 197 mental health professionals who had been disciplined, according to that data.
Mhm.
We have a question from Nick who, getting tactical again, sort of is asking, is there any other particularly instructive recommended reading you can suggest for people looking to do similar work, tip sheets, books, articles, big lessons, takeaways? I think, you mentioned the Dart Center, which is an amazing resource, particularly when it comes to dealing with people who have been in traumatic situations, whether they're hurricanes or sexual abuse. But what else, maybe what did you wish you knew before you started, or what have you learned along the way? Because you've been doing a lot of this kind of coverage.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I'd echo again, the Dart Center is really great, and I really love that they have very specific tip sheets. Like, I remember, because honestly, I've been writing about sexual assault most of my career, but most of the people I talk with are women. This is the first time I really had a lot of men I was trying to talk with, and so I think I remember trying to find on their website, like, is there a guide for, like, sexual assault victims that are men? They really do kind of, like, drill down. I don't think they had something for this, but, usually when I start a new subject, I'll look to them to see if there is a guide or a tip sheet that they've already created. And as far as I mean, this is like really hyper specific, but I grew up in Utah, and so I do understand the culture here pretty well, and I understand like the church, and I've been around it enough, but I really needed to learn a lot about the church's stance against or with regards to its gay members, and that's really shifted over the years. In the 70s, you could be excommunicated if just for saying that you're gay, and that's much different from what we see now, where they're accepted, but they have to be celibate, and they don't get to the highest level of heaven because that's for married heterosexual couples. So I read a book, I don't remember what it was called, but it was nice to have the time and space to be able to like read an entire book about this like evolving stance on gay marriage and its gay members, because it really helped um inform my questions, or talking about, like, with Andrew, I think at the time that he went to therapy, they were at a point where, okay, they were okay with you being gay, but you had to be celibate, and, like, so the timeline's always moving, and so being able to really nail that down and understand the church's policies, I think was really helpful, especially in a story like this where I think if you make errors, small errors about church policy, it kind of undercuts the whole thing, right? Like if it makes it harder for people who are maybe in the church to look at this and think critically about it if they see glaring errors about their religion in the article.
Yeah, so you really understood the context of which this particular series of events was taking place. That's great. Similar, Bill Marimo asks, prior to your first story, did you ever interview Scott Owen? If not, what efforts did you make to interview him or to understand his account of what transpired?
I definitely did try to interview him. I sent him a couple of emails. I think I called his therapist or his office once or twice. Never got back to me, or I think he did actually respond once. So I knew that I had the right email address because he did respond to me at least once to confirm that, I had the right person. But he did not answer any of the questions. He didn't want to sit down for an interview, so I sent him questions. He didn't answer those. So I ended up sending the questions to his office and his home via certified mail because I really, really wanted to make sure that he had seen the questions and had every opportunity to respond. And I really admire that ProPublica's method of doing this. When you write these questions, they call them these no surprise letters. So the idea is, nothing that Scott Owen read in that article would have been a surprise to him. Every allegation that was made in the article was put in front of him as a question, or, this person, Andrew, your former patient, said this happened. What was your recollection of that? Or what was the therapeutic purpose for that? Framing your questions around the facts that will be in the story was really important. Um, and yeah, so he definitely knew the article was coming. He knew everything that was going to be mentioned in it, and he chose not to participate in the article.
Yeah. Well, as a Bill Marimo mentee, I can tell you sending a certified letter is on his to-do list when you're trying to get someone to respond. Um,
100. Sorry, just to add, I before this, when I was working on, like, our podcast, we would do a lot of, like, door knocking, right? That's kind of the way that we used to do journalism when you're trying to track someone down, like, just go to their house. And I don't know, I'm kind of moving away. It doesn't feel safe to me. And as a woman going and knocking on someone's door who I've just been hearing about, allegations of sexual abuse, like, I did not feel comfortable going to his home. And so I think the certified mail is a safer alternative. Because I've never been a big fan of the door knocking, but I think just I don't know, in recent years, it feels more dangerous than it did when I was first starting, but maybe I was just naive back then. But
yeah, that's an interesting point. Speaking of safety, you have been mired in this, really challenging world and hearing people telling you stories of abuse. And I wonder what you do or what you would recommend in terms of protecting yourself. I think anybody who's worked on an intense project for months and months and months, it gets to you, it becomes hard. And I'm just curious how you and ProPublica and you and your newsroom, like, what have you come up with as a sort of way to take care of each other?
Yeah, I mean, this work, especially this story, it can be really isolating when you're the only reporter. I've done a lot of teamwork reporting. This is kind of one of the first times I've been, like, kind of off on my own, which is, like, great to get the space from your editors, but sometimes it's like, "Hello, I'm over here. Does someone, like, talk to me?" So it can be incredibly isolating work, but I think what I tried to do is take it bites at a time. So, limit the amount of difficult interviews you're doing in a day, I try not to do more than 2, even if I'm on a deadline, do more than 2 interviews like that in a day because it can be draining. Or if I do 2, maybe the Tribune doesn't wanna hear this, but, maybe I don't need to work all of the 8 hours that day. Like, I can take a break if I need to because this work is so difficult and so hard. And I think also finding something that takes you away from your computer or, a hobby that you enjoy, like I do yoga or go hiking, it helps to kind of like clear my mind that way. Finding things, I think a lot of times the joke is like, like journalists often will just like drink alcohol to kind of cope with this and like finding healthier ways that you can kind of have an outlet, but you're still, not drinking too much, getting a lot of sleep, all of the things you need to do to take care of yourself, because sometimes you kind of forget about that. You get so zoned in something. And so I think really just taking it a piece at a time and taking it slow, and being like nice to yourself too, like it's okay to say, I need a break right now. I don't want to read these records of sexual abuse for another 2 hours. I'm just gonna go for a walk. Like that's okay. And it's not a sign of weakness that you want to take a break.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really important. This project, you've been working in partnership with ProPublica, for I guess a couple years now. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, the relationship, both yours in particular, but also, you've done a number of partnerships and, what you like about them, what's challenging about them.
Yeah, this is so I've been partnership with Frontline. We did a film on police shootings. I was in a partnership with our local NPR affiliate and American Public Radio for the podcast we did, and then this ProPublica one. So I'm doing a lot of partnerships, and what I like about them is, especially as like a local reporter, I love being a local journalist and being able to partner with these other organizations and kind of amplify your work to a national level is very cool. And they kind of like raise the bar too, like they want to make you do better journalism because, you know, they their standards are very high and they expect a lot. And I love that challenge. I think not this story, but when I was doing our podcast, which was about the troubled teen industry, I loved that, the people who needed information about abuse or mistreatment that was happening in these programs maybe weren't really Utahns because the people who are sending kids here are parents and social workers from all across the country. And so being able to take the story and put it in front of a new audience that actually very critically may need this information is such a great reward of doing these type of partnerships. I will say, the challenges, like I kind of mentioned earlier, like sometimes your newsroom policies conflict with each other, and that can be kind of awkward. And I think a lot of times too, the cadence of a daily news, I guess we don't publish daily anymore, but we are online. We do a web or online edition every day. Like the cadence that my editors like at the Tribune is not the cadence that my partners usually want to be at. And so kind of figuring out how to do the small bites, maybe publish a little bit along the way while also working on a larger project or figuring out, how long do you report until we're ready to do the story can be a little bit challenging, but it's never been, like, awkward or, like, too awkward where, we haven't been able to settle on, "Here's when we should publish," or, "Let's get on the same page as far as the publication schedule."
Yeah, yeah. So December 2023, there was one more development. I wonder if you can tell us what happened and then maybe give us an update. Where is Scott Owen today?
You have to remind me what happened in December.
I think that was the charges against the young girl.
Oh, yes, yes, so he was charged, so initially in November, he was charged in connection to the 2 male patients, and then a month later, he was charged with a female patient. So his court case is kind of just going through the system now. I think he's entering his plea in August, so, we'll just kind of wait to see what happens there, but he's been in jail this since his arrest, so he hasn't tried to or I don't think he's been able to bail out, so he's just been in jail waiting for the court process to go through.
Great. It took a lot of courage, as you said, for people to come forward to talk to you. How did they react to your story? Did they give you any feedback? Do you know how you did?
Yeah, they I thought it was so great right before, I really try to keep in touch with these men as the reporting process went on. And so I'm telling them like the story's gonna publish like tomorrow or whatever day it was. And Andrew wrote me this like very nice message about how this reporting experience, being part of this process was really challenging, but he felt so much more empowered through this process than, the other times when he had tried to hold his therapist accountable. And so they've just been really appreciative. And it's really interesting. The family member that had first contacted me, he's kind of created this support group of people who say that they've had this similar experience. And so I've had other former patients of Scott's email me just asking, "Hey, how do I get in touch with James? I want to be connected with like this little community." And so it's been interesting to see how they've kind of have come together through the media, this being out more and being able to connect with more people and just really getting to know each other more and supporting one another through this shared experience.
Oh, that's wonderful. There's another question. Are there any civil suits against Scott Owen now?
No, no, not yet. I think that one of the issues, at least in Utah, the medical malpractice law puts the statute of limitations at 2 years, and he has not been practicing for, I think, since 2019. So most of these claims would fall under medical malpractice, and uh, that timeline has passed. So I haven't heard of anyone trying to sue him or making that attempt, but there isn't anything right now.
Got it. Got it. Other questions? Well, in the meantime, I'm just going to share my screen one more time so I can share some information with you. Whoops. Let me see. Let's see what I got here. Okay. Yeah, one more. So, um, someone was asking about more tips. Jessica has put together a really great tip sheet, which we'll be posting on the FIJ website along with a recording of this webinar. For those of you interested in applying for an FIJ grant, the next deadline to apply for regular grants, and that is up to $10,000, is September 9th. The next deadline to apply for seed grants. Seed grants are sort of, that early reporting you have to do to figure out, like, is this a story? But, maybe you need documents, maybe you need to go somewhere to do an interview. So these are seed grants up to $2,500, right? The deadline for applying for that is September 20th. You can find all the details about how to apply on the FIJ website. And also, if you have any questions about anything, there's also a video about how to apply. So please use that website. We want to help you try to get one of these grants. That's what we're here for. We're here to support your work. We're going to take a couple of months off for the summer, but we'll be back in September. We're going to have two groups of reporters who both reported on guardianship, one from the Maine Monitor and then WLRN in South Florida. Incredible stories. Samantha Hogan from the Maine Monitor just won this year's Livingston Award for her work on guardianship problems and probate courts in Maine. So I hope you'll join us. Let me just double check to see if there are any more questions. There aren't. Well, I would say have a wonderful, long, happy weekend. And thank you so much, Jessica. I really appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.